In the Democratic Party, a self-described socialist who has been an independent for most of his political career is now outpolling once presumptive nominee Hillary Clinton in the first two primary states.
The American political system has been totally corrupted, and the foundations of American democracy are being undermined.
Our next guest has a word for the difference between Bernie Sanders and the other Democratic contenders, and that word is authenticity. A sense that the candidate is sticking to a set of principles he believes in, regardless of what the polls and the focus groups say. Now, our next guest has a word for the difference between Bernie Sanders and the other Democratic contenders, and that word is authenticity. A sense that the candidate is sticking to a set of principles he believes in, regardless of what the polls and the focus groups say. But what's been unclear, and this is partly because the Sanders campaign became a phenomenon faster than just about anyone expected, what's unclear is how those principles translate into concrete policy proposals. Now, you will recall that we had Norman Solomon on a short time ago criticizing the fact that the Sanders campaign has not articulated a very specific foreign policy platform yet. You'll also recall the discussions that we've had about how the Sanders campaign didn't articulate a specific racial justice agenda until after Black Lives Matter protesters started disrupting his campaign events. Well, our next guest has taken on the task of pinning down what it is that makes Bernie Sanders, at least as a politician, combing through decades of speeches and writings to stake out the remarkably consistent positions he's taken during his life in politics. Jonathan Tasini is a writer and analyst, past president of the National Writers Union, publisher of the Working Life blog and podcast, and author of many books. The latest is just out. It's a collection of speeches and writings by Bernie Sanders called The Essential Bernie Sanders and His Vision for America. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Why publish an anthology of a candidate's writings?
In my view, one of the things about Bernie Sanders that is needed is a connection to many, many voters. He is not, I would say, universally known nationally. And this compilation, it was designed as, in some way, an organizing tool, a way for voters, both supporters of his already and people who are kind of curious about him, to find a lot more about him. So I actually, in some ways, a writer, this was the challenge, had to step away and step out of the middle. And 95% of this is really Bernie himself speaking.
Your introduction frames his campaign in terms of this authenticity. You're painting a picture of someone who's more interested in moving the polls than in chasing after them.
Yes, I think that, and sometimes that works conveniently. If you are authentic, people gravitate to that. And I liked your introduction when you're talking about the formerly presumed frontrunner, because I think in Iowa and New Hampshire, that authenticity is coming to play, and we'll see how that plays out over time. But I do think that what's great about Bernie Sanders and what people just feel right away, even if you don't agree with every single thing he says, you believe he believes it. And you think he believes it, and it comes from a man who actually has believed and had a set of principles for 30, 40 years.
I want to start with probably the most iconic of the speeches he's delivered in his career. And this is a 2010 filibuster speech, an 8-hour-long speech when Congress was considering extending Bush-era tax cuts. You quote from it extensively over the course of the book.
Not only do I quote from it, I remember it very well because it ruined my entire day.
You can call what I'm doing today whatever you want. You can call it a filibuster. You can call it a very long speech. I'm not here to set any great records or to make a spectacle. I am simply here today to take as long as I can to explain to the American people the fact that we have got to do a lot better than this agreement provides.
I had C-SPAN on, which just shows you kind of what a wonky person I can be. And I saw him get on the floor, and I thought, okay, I'll listen to him for a few minutes because he's always got something interesting to say. And 7 or 8 hours there, I was still stuck on my sofa as I was tweeting it and putting it on Facebook. It was an amazing speech because it encapsulated a history and a recounting and an indictment, if you will, of the economic system that had impoverished and stolen for the livelihoods and futures of millions of Americans.
The Walton family alone would receive an estimated $32.7 billion tax break if the estate tax was completely repealed. One family, $32.7 billion. This is patently insane. This is insane. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. We have massive unemployment. The Walton family itself, we get more than double in a tax break what some of us are fighting for over 50 million seniors and disabled vets.
A lot of filibuster speeches, you get a sense that somebody is just trying to fill time. But at least from the excerpts you quote, you have a sense that he still had more to say.
Definitely. And let's be clear, it wasn't a filibuster in the classical sense of what you remember. A real filibuster was like 40, 50 years ago. Number one, it wasn't until he dropped off his feet, although 8 hours is a long time. And it wasn't there precisely at a time to try to block a particular piece of legislation. He was filling a lot of open time, so it was called a Bernie filibuster, a very special kind of thing where he rose and spoke for 8 hours. It was a long speech, and I think that he certainly had more to say. But look, he said it in a very concise way, and I think it is very remarkable time.
Well, let's talk about some of the positions and principles he laid out in that speech and elsewhere. I think by this point, just about all of our listeners are familiar with the fact that he rails against billionaires and oligarchs and would like to change campaign financing and the distribution of wealth and income in this country. But he's kind of rolled up his sleeves and gotten into the nitty-gritty as well. He spearheaded the effort to get a top-to-bottom audit of the Federal Reserve.
That's correct. Because if somebody offers you free money, essentially, money with virtually no interest rate, you'd be a fool not to take it. And those loans were secret, essentially. And the Federal Reserve, in particular, Alan Greenspan and actually Bernanke, the more recent Federal Reserve chairman, who was in office at the time, refused to tell Bernie Sanders who those loans went to. So he had to essentially pass a piece of legislation that would require them to audit the Fed.
And how did that audit turn out?
The main thing that Bernie was focused on is he wanted to know where the money went to bail out the banks. How was that money spent? What was the accountability? And what he uncovered was the huge, vast sums of money that was being lent to banks, many of whom did not need the money, but they got this really cheap money. And Bernie Sanders' point was very clear. There was a classic congressional hearing. I won't quote it verbatim here, but I'll give you the sense of it, where he basically said, look, my people, my voters, my members who are in Vermont, the people I represent, the residents, want to know where they can get that money. Because regular people and small businesses could not get loans. You may remember that the whole loan sector, the liquidity had just dried up. It was almost impossible for regular people to get money. And Bernie Sanders' point was, if these banks can get the money, why can't my people, why can't voters, why can't average people get loans?
Will you tell the American people to whom you lent $2.2 trillion of their dollars, will you tell us who got that money and what the terms are of those agreements?
We explain each of our programs. In terms of the terms, we explain the terms exactly. We explain what the collateral requirements are. We explain what.
To whom did you explain that?
It's on our website.
Yeah. Okay.
So all that information is available in our commercial paper program.
And who got the money?
Hundreds and hundreds of banks. Any bank that has access to the U.S. Federal Reserve's discount.
Can you tell us who they are?
No, because the reason that is counterproductive and will destroy the value of the program is that banks will not come to the business.
Oh, isn't that too bad?
Sorry?
In other words, isn't that too bad? They took the money, but they don't want to be public about the fact that they received it. We heard a whole lot about AIG. They're in the front pages.
These are very.
Now, I got banks and I have businesses in the state of Vermont who are in a lot of trouble. Not banks. Our banks, by the way, are doing pretty well. Now, how do these guys who are honest business people get it? Do you have to be a large, greedy, reckless financial institution to apply for these monies?
When he proposes that top-to-bottom audit of the Fed, this is 2010, he's an independent. He's not even inside the Democratic Party in the Senate. What kind of coalition building did he have to do to actually be effective, rather than just someone who's grandstanding on the margins of the political deal-making process?
On the Fed, he had a number of people, including Sherrod Brown, who came to the floor of the Senate to support him and ask questions and essentially buttress him. This was back on the Senate speech, the long speech when he talked about inequality in the banks. Down the road, when it came to the Fed, he had an odd alliance because people like Rand Paul, for example, were in alliance with him around the Fed. The Fed had been the subject of questions, at least on the Democratic side, a little bit on the Republican side. People don't trust somewhat on the Republican side that concentration of power. People had questions about the Fed and its independence and whether Congress was able to have effective oversight of the Fed. To your general point, Bernie Sanders has, since he's been in the United States Senate, caucused with the Democrats, and he's provided key votes and has been able to actually make coalitions with other people on particular issues. I'll give you a great example. When the Democrats held control of the Senate, Bernie Sanders was chair of the Veterans Committee, and he led a massive overhaul of the Veterans Administration, passed a multi-billion-dollar bill, including with the support of, among others, John McCain. Now, McCain didn't agree with every little specific, and they tussled over it, and there's a quote from McCain about that. He said, look, Bernie's a tough guy, but at the end of the day, I respected his position, and we got to a compromise. So he is able to actually forge compromise. He is able to get to legislative solutions. Obviously, he needs a majority for that.
Which begs the question, if he was effective as an independent, why toss his hat in this late in his career as a contender for the Democratic nomination for president?
Look, Bernie Sanders is a successful politician. Let's underscore that. He is a authentic guy. He's got deep principles, but he's won elections time after time, going back to his service as mayor of Burlington when he was counted out and won and served successive terms, 4 terms. Then he went into the House and won that seat, and then he captured the Senate seat. So he knows how to win elections, and he made, I think, the right choice and the right calculation. You cannot win the presidency of the United States right now as an independent. Michael Bloomberg, to use a different example, considered some years ago running for president. This was, as we know, a guy who is worth $20 billion, who could spend as much as he would want to win. He made the calculation that looking at the Electoral College, looking at the dominance of the two parties and the name brand, that he could not win even though he had unlimited money. And I think Bernie Sanders obviously is not going to have that kind of billionaire money. And he made the calculation that the only way to try to affect a political revolution, which he underscores what his campaign is about, is to run as a Democrat.
Now, the criticism from the hard left has been the functional role of his campaign will be to shore up the Democratic Party's left flank, to get progressives excited and involved in the Democratic primary, and then to follow Bernie Sanders' lead when he eventually loses and throws his support to Hillary Clinton.
Oh, I don't have much patience anymore for the hard left. I think they're living in a dream world of, great debates, accomplished almost nothing. Look, Sanders' campaign, in my view, is part of building a movement. The reason I'm excited about it, and you have to be crazy to not want to support someone who says up front he's a socialist, a democratic socialist. He's arguing for the breaking up of banks, about inequality, about taking on the billionaires, about $15 an hour minimum wage at the federal level, and on and on and on. And if you can't support that, then you know what? Go back to your debating society, and you don't have to be part of electoral politics. But to me, it's an advancement. It's along a progression that you could cite Occupy Wall Street as part of it, even further back going to Paul Wellstone, a progressive senator from Minnesota, who advanced this. History doesn't change overnight. And so I'm excited about it because he is, and he completely argues this, that he's trying to ignite a political revolution.
I guess the question is, the odds are still against him becoming president. What is left behind from this campaign if he doesn't actually wind up sitting in the White House in 2017?
Let's take that in 2 ways. First of all, I would say that he has a steep hill to climb. But when you asked me that question, when I was asked this question 4 or 5 months ago by friends and political associates, I would have used the steep hill and had very, very, very 10 times before that. That's not the case anymore. I think that if he wins Iowa and New Hampshire, which he has a good shot at doing, we'll see what happens. There's a long way to go. The whole nature of the landscape will change overnight. So I would say that he understands that there's a moment in time that he's igniting a huge wave of interest in the campaign, and how you coalesce that, and we can go into the details of that if you want. That's certainly a challenge, but let me tell you, the way in which he's moved the campaign and changed the debate and shifted the political center, and I mean that in terms of where the energy is, has been astonishing and dramatic. But let's say he falls short. It seems to me that a couple of things will happen, and some of this will depend on what he wants to do with the movement. If he decides to take this movement and create something outside the electoral system where he'll have probably, I'm going to guess by the time he's over, 1 million or 2 million people on an email list and a small donor base and people all over the country who are fed up with the system, into something that becomes a piece of growing a political movement around overturning Citizens United, a whole host of things. That'll be kind of up to him and his inner circle. But even separate from that, one of the things I've noticed is a lot of people who I've talked to are new people, young people have come into the process who have never been there before, and those people will have been touched somehow, and they will then find their place, I think, in all sorts of movements, civil rights movement, the labor movement, women's movement, and other places, and we can only assess how that will go maybe 10 years from now.
It's the voice of Jonathan Tasini, former president of the National Writers Union, a writer, author, political strategist, and now editor of a book called The Essential Bernie Sanders and His Vision for America. It is a collection of excerpts from the speeches and writings of Bernie Sanders spanning more than 2 decades of his political career in Washington. And if you are trying to understand the candidate who seems to have changed the political landscape in the Democratic primary, this is probably the best book for you. At least it's the best book we could find. It just came out. It's been published this month. And we're offering it as a thank you gift during our fund drive for a pledge of $100 or more at 1-800-439-5732. And Jonathan Tasini does a really good job in the book of introducing and contextualizing everything that he brings in from Bernie Sanders. He's got speeches on wars abroad, excerpts from the more than 8-hour-long filibuster speech that Bernie Sanders gave over the proposed extension of the Bush-era tax cuts. He has long discussions on the nature of inequality and what to do about it, an entire section on the environment, another one on education, a third on health care, a fourth on infrastructure, a fifth on money and politics. All of it is footnoted so that you can follow any excerpt online to the full primary source. It is indexed in detail, so you can look up multiple references to a particular topic area. And if you're someone who's been looking to arm yourself with information in this campaign, if you want to be able to quote Sanders, if you want to be able to argue for or against him, if you want to just be able to discuss him in an informed way with someone else, and think about pledging for this book and helping out KPFA while you do it. The Essential Bernie Sanders, edited by Jonathan Tasini, is yours for a pledge of $100 or more at 1-800-439-5732. The second thing we are offering is a full transcript of that more than 8-hour-long filibuster speech that Bernie Sanders gave in 2010 that really put him on the national map. It is more than 250 pages long. For something that was given as a semi-extemporaneous speech, it is remarkably coherent, an indictment, a searing indictment of inequality in America, how we got here, and what it might take to get out. And that book, which is called The Speech, A Historic Filibuster on Corporate Greed and the Decline of Our Middle Class by Senator Bernie Sanders, is yours for a pledge of just $75 or more. The two books together, we discount the combined pledge rate to $150. At 1-800-439-5732. And, of course, the most important thing you get with that pledge is this radio station. We try to be a space for the political conversations that actually matter. So that when Bernie Sanders announced, instead of having the could he win conversation, we had the what does he stand for conversation. When he was challenged by Black Lives Matter, we started talking about race and progressive politics in America. The same on foreign policy. And we're going to get into some of those critical questions a little bit later in this segment. What we're asking you to do with your pledge this hour is to ensure we have the resources it takes to bring those conversations into the future. There's something really exciting about this moment in America, because regardless of who the candidate is, what you're seeing is a significant chunk of the American public get excited and mobilized around attacking inequality, around attacking money in politics, around fixing some of the profound problems that we address on this radio station. And if you're trying to understand the vehicle under which that is happening, we think that these are the best gifts we can offer you. The Essential Bernie Sanders is yours for $75. The Speech, $100. The two together, $150 at 1-800-439-5732. All right. Final piece of news before we go back. We have two listeners, Jeffrey and Jonathan in Sebastopol, who are prepared to match $1,000 if we can raise $1,000 from you this hour. So, we're going to head back to the interview. We're going to see how many of you call. How many of you call kind of makes or breaks us, because we're committed to bringing you as much content as possible and as little fundraising. The $1,000 countdown starts now. 1-800-HEY-KPFA or online at www.kpfa.org. Back to our discussion with Jonathan Tasini. Jonathan Tasini, I want to go through some of the controversies over his campaign. You mentioned the first two primary states, New Hampshire and then Iowa. Quick on their heels comes South Carolina, where African-American voters play a massive role in the Democratic Party, and where Bernie Sanders is consistently polling behind Hillary Clinton by more than 20 points. The criticism coming from Black Lives Matter protesters who disrupted some of his early campaign events was that he hadn't really spoken to their issues yet. Where has he been on questions of racial justice?
Well, honestly, I think that's partly BS and partly legitimate in the sense of the emotional feeling that Black Lives Matter brings to an important issue, which is that black people are being shot down by police in cities all across America. And Bernie Sanders has a long history of being an advocate and a fighter for civil rights. That's just the track record. Now, it is true that the Clintons have bought people off. And there is, as Cornel West says, Cornel West is one of the key endorsers that Bernie has in the African-American community. I was just in South Carolina a couple of days ago with Cornel, and he said in every place, he said, look, the problem is that we've been asleep. And when you're asleep and people are selling you something that is not true, and he was referring to the Clintons, then you don't know anything else. And so our job, meaning he was speaking for himself and for the African-American movement and those people who support him, is to wake people up. And once you wake people up, I'm quoting now, paraphrasing Cornell, then people start to pay attention to facts and not a poll-tested, ad-driven image. And I'm confident that Sanders will be able to overcome that. Part of that will happen over time. There's a great ground game that's going on in South Carolina now that's being built in every city, and I saw it in at least 3 cities over the weekend. And as I said before, post-Iowa and New Hampshire, assuming Bernie Sanders wins, all this stuff about polling will mean almost nothing. Because all of a sudden people will pay attention. South Carolinians will all of a sudden look at themselves as next in line, and they will start to make the comparison. And I'm confident that Bernie Sanders can and will win South Carolina. And if he doesn't win, he will come so close, just a matter of time, that the delicate apportionment won't be that significant between him and Clinton, assuming that they're the only two candidates in the race at the time.
But I guess the deeper question, and I was struck by this going through your book, there are all these policy areas where you kind of bullet point and show excerpts from decades of history of Bernie Sanders taking very specific policy positions on the environment and climate change. There he is on the Senate floor saying we need a carbon tax to raise the money to move this country away from burning fossil fuels. When it comes to inequality, you have him advocating for a financial transactions tax to pay for free college education. You have him arguing for a much more progressive system of taxation, and on and on and on. And when it comes to a civil rights agenda or a racial justice agenda, that history just doesn't seem to be there, aside from an offhand remark about how bad unemployment is in the African-American community.
Well, I think that's false. First of all, it is true that he represents a state which is predominantly white, and so he is very attuned to being responsive on a really granular level to his constituents. That's number one. Number two, whether you like it or not, to him, and I think to a lot of people, to Cornel West, to a lot of activists, when you talk about Black Lives Matter, the issues of unemployment and racism are parallel tracks. One of the reasons that African Americans have such high levels of unemployment and historically have trailed in wages is because of racism, because people used racism to divide whites and blacks, certainly in the South, but all across the country. Bernie Sanders has spoken about that repeatedly. Now, I will say that what Black Lives Matter has done, and by the way, I think that their protest at Netroots Nation and other places was terrific because it needs to be put on the national agenda, and people have to be completely reminded that every day the lives of black people are threatened in the streets by police who use force. But I don't buy the notion that somehow Bernie Sanders is blind to it or has not been active in that. I just don't think that's true.
Jonathan Tasini, I want to pivot to foreign policy. You have, among other things in your collection of Bernie Sanders' writing and speeches, the speech he made when he was announcing his presidency. And on the topic of foreign policy, he proposed continuing the war against the Islamic State, but under the leadership of a coalition headed by Muslim-majority countries.
Yes, we must be vigorous in combating terrorism and defeating ISIS. But we as a nation should not have to bear that burden alone. We must be part of an international coalition led by the Muslim nations that can not only defeat ISIS, but begin the process of creating conditions for lasting peace.
In subsequent talks, he said he would like to see Saudi Arabia largely financing and leading efforts there.
The United States cannot do it alone. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has the third largest military budget in the entire world. They're going to have to get in and take on ISIS as well as other countries in that region. The United States should be supportive. We should be working with other countries. But the United States cannot always be the only country involved in these wars.
Which is something that some of the foreign policy analysts we've had on say, like disastrously bad. Reactionary regime that's in a highly polarized relationship with some of its neighbors shouldn't be on the ground in a place like Syria or Iraq.
Well, I think that he sees a bad situation getting worse. And I think my sense is, and you'll have to ask the campaign this because I don't have an insight into their specific notion of the issue about Saudi Arabia. But my suspicion is, knowing his opposition to the Iraq war, the escalation in Afghanistan and so forth, his impetus is the United States doesn't do any good by getting into conflicts, and that his first instinct is to say, I'm not going to choose, at least from the United States point of view, war over diplomacy. It's one reason he's been a strong supporter of the Iran deal. So, look, and I'm speaking for myself, in my view, the United States has destroyed that region. And my view years ago was that the United States could not fix it, quote unquote. It had to basically withdraw and not increase its involvement.
What about the fact that he did vote to support the invasion of Afghanistan?
My guess is, and I don't remember the exact speech and what, it's not in the book, so I don't remember the exact reason he gave, but my guess is that his argument was that they were the ones. That was where al-Qaeda was, and that was the argument to invade Afghanistan and that was the argument to invade Afghanistan and that was the argument to invade Afghanistan and that was the argument to invade